Hello and welcome to my complete World War II video series. Now, on a much shorter part one, as you can see, I covered the final manoeuvrings politically prior to the war from 1939, going from March, April 1939 up until the end of August 1939, in the final lead up to World War II. And now on this video, I will talk about the Wehrmacht's quick and completely destructive campaign ran against the armies of Poland, and some of the forces broken down, and what happened in the fight. Now, first of all, what I want to do, is just do a little talk, on this, because towards the end of 1939, the Wehrmacht had just over 98 divisions. Now, only 60, some of those divisions were active, and the Germans, from what I remember, included 55 divisions in the war. They did have the Germans, some of the divisions, but they were more older units, and some of them, of course, manned the German western border. Now, a few things before we go more into the campaign in Poland is a few crazy items I wish to mention. Now, the Polish High Command, which still, for the most part, was fighting on the belief that this war would be fought along the lines of World War I. Massed armies in areas and massed armies along the frontier. Now, the French tried to warn them, The French tried to warn the Poles about the new German mechanised units and armoured formations, and it kind of went on deaf ears. The Poles, along the entire front line they had with Germany, it was a ridiculous amount of miles, coming to probably something like 1,200 miles. Now, the French offered a plan to the Poles whereby they could reduce their front lines, concentrate their forces, use natural kind of terrain to put blockages in front of the German armoured units and infantry units, like natural river barriers, destroying bridges, anything to try and entrap and slow the German advance down. But these mainly fell on deaf ears. The Polish, as you can see on the slide, the Pomeranian army and the Poznan army included like a third of the Poles' total forces. And the reason for that is the Polish army high command was completely in delusional world, because they had this belief that upon receipt of the German attack, the Pomeranian army and the Poznan army would be able to launch a swift counter-attack, advance into Germany a distance of near 60 miles, and actually capture Berlin. Which the Polish High Command believed would then force the German army units advancing into Poland to pause, regroup, and defend their capital. The Polish army was completely unprepared, for the new tactics of warfare that the Wehrmacht would unleash on Europe, namely Blitzkrieg, which is a much earlier version of what we'd now call combined arms. The World War I thought methodology was you mass forces along the entire frontier and just pin the enemy troops as they're trying to break into your territory. Pin them there, hold them there, fight them there, to stop them advancing through your territory. But General Guderian, a fantastic general, and others came up with the tactics of Blitzkrieg, which called upon fierce and heavy artillery bombardment in conjunction with massive airstrikes by the Luftwaffe, including pinpoint dive bomb attacks by the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The skies had been patrolled by Messerschmitt, B-110 fighters, Bf-109s, Heinkel and Dornier bombers, and the whole point was that the artillery would bombard enemy positions for a short time. The Luftwaffe would launch raking raids both on frontline units and in rear areas, looking to take out the Polish Air Force, looking to destroy their military airfields, so what left of the Polish Air Force would have trouble mobilising and fighting them in the skies. At the same time, the Stuka dive bombers had launched pinpoint raids on Polish artillery positions, bridges, supply lanes, everything, while the tanks attacked in more narrow formation, with the idea of Blitzkrieg to punch through the enemy line and then power ahead, leaving the mechanised units, motorised divisions, infantry to follow up behind. Now, the Blitzkrieg tactics also, as you can see here from the disposition at German armies and Polish armies, called on the Germans to launch wars of encirclements, They would then terribly used this same tactic in 1941, which will take a while to get to, during Operation Barbarossa and their plans to attack the Soviet Union. The German army would employ similar tactics. The idea is the Stukas, the artillery, the air force bombard enemy positions, supply lanes, airfields. The tanks punch through enemy army lines, advance, cut off those armies from supply, and then would meet up with other armies in performing encirclements, of enemy positions, thus cutting them off from all supplies, lack of communication, and it basically leaves the armies and troops disorientated, at which time the German infantry and motorised divisions following the panzers can actually come in and mop up any pockets. And the Germans successfully used these tactics of blitzkrieg in Poland, in other areas, devastatingly in France as well, as we will go through when we get to the campaign in France that Hitler wanted to launch in January 1940, but his generals managed to talk him out of it, and the attack came later in 1940, as we will go through. But the Polish army fighting on the provision of World War I tactics was completely unprepared, for the attack of the Wehrmacht. They were trying to defend a front line of over 1,200 miles against concentrated German forces, and frankly, it was never going to work. The Polish army, pretty much had like 30 infantry divisions. They only had like 100 old, antiquated tanks. They did have over 40 regiments of artillery, but the sad thing about the Polish artillery is it was still horse-drawn, whereas the Germans, even though they had horse-drawn elements within their army, the Germans were still mechanising their forces, motorising their forces, and already had a large element of motorised artillery, which gave them a much bigger advantage. Mechanised units need refuelling, but they don't tire, they don't tire like horses. It's much easier for them to traverse rough terrain, muddy terrain, than for horses, stepping through, 6-inch of mud. It's just generally an easier, faster, more efficient way of transporting artillery to new positions where they need it. The Poles also had nearly 40 regiments of cavalry, and of course one of the major first engagements in the war, one of the pitched battles, was when Polish cavalry regiments attacked one of the panzer armies head on, which didn't go very well for the Poles. But the Polish Air Force, they only had like 400 operational aircraft there or thereabouts. Many of them antiquated. Many of them, of their main fighters, for example, were the PZ-L4 fighters, way slower, way less armed, smaller range than the German planes. They were just totally not prepared to tackle the Messerschmitt Bf-109s in the air. And the Polish Air Force was destroyed as a fighting force within a matter of a few days for the most part. The Polish artillery also, many of the Polish artillery pieces, some of them even dated back to World War I. Whereas even though, with Germany, they had begun a rapid modernisation programme since they begun rebuilding their army fully in 1936, and even though there were still some older elements within their army, there was also in the German army a growing mechanised, modern, aspect to the forces that put them completely on a different level to the Polish army, even though the Polish army fought very well in many cases. I mean, take the German tanks, for example. We had the PZKW-1 tank, which was a very small tank, only weighed about 6 tons. It had 2 machine guns. It was fast and manoeuvrable, but, machine guns could pepper them. Not the greatest effective tank. The really powerful tank was a PZKW-4, but they were still in early numbers. They didn't have really large numbers of them. They had PZKW-2s and 3s. So ultimately, going forward, the German army was already much more mechanised and was fighting under a different rule book. The German army had a large army now. As we can see here on map, the German army was broken up into concentrated fronts where each army would have targets. They would crash through the Polish defences, performing circle movements using blitzkrieg, and basically, chop up, dissect, and then mop up the Polish army. Now, the German forces included in the war, from East Prussia and Pomerania, was on the left flank. They had the Third Army, under General Kuchler. He had 8 infantry divisions. He was to assist in destruction of Polish forces in the corridor. Then he was to drive south towards Vistula and Warsaw, okay? So he was supposed to mop up the armies in the Danzig corridor. Once that was completed in conjunction with German 4th Army, the German 3rd Army would head towards the Vistula and Warsaw. Then we had on the right flank the 4th Army under General Kluge. He had 6 infantry divisions, 2 motorised divisions and a panzer division. He was to attack Pomerania and destroy, engaged head-on the main body of the Pomeranian army, thus tying up the Danzig corridor and cutting any forces off there from Polish lines. Now in Silesia and Slovakia we had the left flank, okay, which was the 8th Army. The 8th Army had 4 infantry divisions and included the SS motorised regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, okay. They were to engage Polish forces in the Poznan-Kutno region and to also tie them down, okay, so that they could then not go help the Pomeranian and Poznan armies in the north. Then in the centre we had the German 10th Army, okay. The German 10th Army included 6 infantry divisions, 2 motorised divisions, 2 panzer divisions and 3 light divisions. They were to drive northeast, okay, straight for Lodz, Warsaw, okay. So they were to cut straight across the Prussian and Peace Corps armies, head straight for Warsaw, and then, as I've said earlier, the German 3rd Army and 4th Army, once they mopped up, the Danzig corridor, the Poznan and Pomeranian armies, then the German 3rd Army would also, going southeast, head to Warsaw as well. Thus hoping to create encirclements of the remaining aspects of the Poznan and Lodz armies. Now, as well as that, we had the right flank, okay, the German 14th Army. They had a mountain division, 6 infantry divisions, 2 panzer divisions, and they had the SS motorised regiment Germania. They were to strike across the Carpathians and to basically pin down the Polish forces around Krakow. So this was the disposition of the armies in preparation for the Polish campaign. Now, the Polish armies, a number of their divisions were still tied up in barracks. A number of their divisions were still being fully mobilised and hadn't even got to the front. So basically, they had an army initially on the first day of the war of roughly 30 divisions, okay, to hold that enormous front against the new concentrated motorised tank formations of the German army using blitzkrieg tactics, which was never ever really going to work. The German Air Force as well, to counter the 400 plus planes in the Polish Air Force, many of them antiquated, outdated designs, like I said, the PZL-4, I'll do a little bit of a breakdown on that, and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Dornier and Heinkel bombers, and the Junkers Stuka dive bomber, of course, on my equipment playlist. I'll add those every now and then too. But the Germans pretty much had 2,700 aircraft operational, 771 fighters. They also included 336 Stuka dive bombers and also included over 1,000 high-level bombers. Many of them aircraft, like I've already said, were some of the best modern combat aircraft in Europe until the full growth of the numbers of the British Supermarine Spitfire, and of course the older but still very capable Hawker Hurricane, which we will also cover on some little videos going through their armaments, etc. So the stage was set, okay, the stage was set for World War II. Like Hitler said back in May to the German generals, you will now get exactly what you want. Now, the war opened at 4:45 a.m. on the morning of September 1st, okay. The German army crossed the Polish frontier, Operation White Plan, which was the code name for the attack on Poland. Now, there'd been no reply, okay, to appeals made of King Leopold of Belgium. There'd been no reply to anyone. Hitler was now set on the destruction of Poland, and many in Europe were still not aware of the agreement made with the Soviet Union in relation to the partition of Poland, as we will get to. But basically, the German armies opened the war, okay. The Polish defences were initially overwhelmed very quickly. The Germans, with the new mechanised tank formations, the pinpoint aircraft attacks, and the rapid speed of the new blitzkrieg tactics, caught many at Polish positions completely at sea. The Germans already within the first day were cutting through the formations and driving miles into rear at Polish armies, still on border, disorientated, not knowing half of the time what was going on. Now, basically, the success of the German attack initially was to be expected. Like I said, the Polish army were fighting on World War I principles for the most part, and had old or antiquated equipment. Now, there had been a deal, Okay, there had been a deal, like I mentioned a little while ago, about the partition of Poland. Now, that was drawn up in the Russo-German Pact from August 23rd, okay, and it caused a demarcation line between Germany and the USSR to run down the lines of the Naru and Vistula and San rivers, okay. Lithuania was to be included in German sphere of influence, while the Russian sphere includes Estonia, Latvia, and other areas in the Baltic. Also, Russia was kind of given leeway to attack Finland in that situation, which we will, of course, cover the Russo-Finnish War. Now, by September 2nd, okay, the Germans are already attacking at full speed, okay. The four main border battle areas are all equally overwhelmed. The German army quickly punches through the Polish defences. The forces advance already join up with those forces from East Prussia. This is by the 24th. This is by the 2nd of December, sorry. They already linked up with advance armies from the German 4th and 3rd armies already meeting up, okay. They penetrated 50 miles in 36 hours, okay, 50 miles in 36 hours into Polish territory. Some of those Polish divisions must have been wondering what the heck was going on. The German tanks punched through and kept going. The Polish infantry units lost sight of German armour. They were dealt with by motorised infantry divisions. The Poles will have had no idea where the German army was going, what the full strength numbers were. They were just overrun. Now, basically, on September 2nd, also, there were high-level discussions between Paris and London. They already started discussing their pledge, okay, to help Poland should Poland's neutrality be attacked. Now, Italy also declares on September 2nd that she is non-belligerent, okay, and the German government declares also on September 2nd it will respect the territorial integrity of Norway, provided okay, it is not attacked or threatened, or Norway will allow no British forces to be stationed there to threaten German shipping or naval bases. Now, by September 3rd, okay, France and Britain officially enter the war against Germany at 9 a.m. in the morning. Okay, Sir Neville Henderson, the British ambassador in Berlin, sends His Majesty's government's ultimatum to counsel at Paul Schmidt, Hitler's interpreter. The document states that unless by 11 a.m. within 2 hours the Germans have been given definite assurances about the withdrawal of their forces from Poland, Britain will consider itself at war with Germany. France too finally takes action. At 12 o'clock lunchtime, Robert Coulondre, French ambassador in Berlin, delivers an ultimatum to expire the following day. The French are giving Germany until September 4th to begin a full retreat from Polish territory. But, in a last-ditch attempt to conciliate with German dictator, the document explicitly does not use the word war. Okay, so while the British say we are now at war with Germany as of now, the French give the Germans 24 hours saying start pulling out now, but they don't actually state we will consider ourselves at war with Germany. So they're still, playing a little bit of a game. And then at 11 a.m. that morning, Britain is officially at war with Germany. At 10 Downing Street, Neville Chamberlain, says we've nothing to reproach ourselves with. God protect us and defend the right. Winston Churchill on the 3rd of September becomes the First Lord of Admiralty, and Anthony Eden becomes the Secretary of State, for British holdings around the world. So basically the war is on, okay, the war is on. Britain on September 3rd also declares a naval blockade of Germany. All ships taking any goods, supplies, anything of the kind to Germany are to be stopped, boarded and confiscated. Now at 5 p.m, okay, on September 3rd, clearly Hitler's not going to listen to the French ultimatum that they gave 24 hours on, so France declares war on Germany, and thus the Allied powers in Europe are fully at war with Germany. And the war's begun, and it's a long war, and it's the bloodiest and biggest conflagration to me of all time. Now, in Poland, by September 5th, the Germans have already, forced to the Vistula River, and they're already preparing to cross the Naru and Western Bug rivers, okay? On September 5th, also, United States follows Japan. On September 4th, Japan declared her neutrality and said they were concentrating on China. The United States also on September 5th proclaims its neutrality. Now on 6th of September, okay, the 3rd and 4th Armies at German Army Group North and the 8th and 10th Armies coming from southern Germany into the region of the Lotz Army. advance on Warsaw. The German 3rd and 4th Armies have linked up. The German 3rd Army, following the plan, is already now heading southeast, elements of it to head towards Warsaw. And the German 8th and 10th Armies, crashing through the border, are also coming northeast from the opposite direction, also towards Warsaw. Okay. Now, basically, at this point, the Polish army is already completely in disarray. Okay, it's already in disarray. General List, okay, in command of the 14th Army, captures Krakow, okay, and he actually reaches elements of the Romanian border. The Polish Supreme Commander, okay, gives the order for a general retreat. The Polish armies have been caught out. They are in complete disarray. Some units are already being encircled. Communications have been affected by the German attacks on communication centres, bridges. Supplies are already struggling to get to Polish armies, and they have no effective information already. Many of them are cut off from what is going on during the war. Now, during the night of September 6th, okay, the Polish government left Warsaw, obviously with the German 8th, 10th, and elements at German 3rd Army already headed towards the vicinity of Warsaw. The Polish government decides to leave Warsaw. Also on September 6th, okay, in something that won't matter too much, South Africa declared war on Germany. Now, during this time, okay, France also launched their plan to put pressure on Germany by attacking the Western German frontier. Now, at this point, it was rumoured that France had about 110 divisions, including, all their available divisions, but they didn't have that many. They had just over 80, from what I recall. They had just over 80 divisions, but it has to be remembered that if France would have put a much more concerted attack on the German front line, they may have had more success and may have even been able to get Hitler to divert forces from Poland to the Western Front, because on that Western Front, Germany had something like 25 divisions, and really, with the mass French armies around the area, they probably wouldn't have been able to resist the French army's advance. But the real impetuousness of France was not there to invade Germany and enter the war. They had to declare war on Germany due to the agreement they made with Britain and Poland. But I still think in some ways France really didn't want to go into war. Hence on September 3rd, when they actually issued an ultimatum but did not put the word war in there. Of course, later that day they did declare war. Now, basically, by September 11th, okay, fighting is taking place at Radom, okay, which is only 60 miles south of Warsaw. So elements at German 8th or 10th Army are already within 60 miles of Warsaw itself within 11 days. Now, on September 9th, okay, the 4th Panzer Division launched its first attack on Warsaw from the southeast, but it is absolutely engaged in fierce fighting, and the Poles actually managed to drive it back. Now, on September 10th, okay, many countries through this period, from South Africa, Japan and America declaring neutrality. Canada also declares war on Germany. By September 11th, the industrial area of Upper Silesia is completely taken by German forces, and it's a large industrial area in Poland. It's now been totally overrun by German forces. Now, the Polish army, okay, now I mentioned at the start, the Polish army, elements of the Poznan and Pomeranian armies, upon hearing of the German attack and being attacked, were to rather ludicrously set course for Berlin and attack Berlin. But what those armies actually do, okay, is they turn direction and attack the German 8th Army, advancing up through the area of the former Lodz Army to cut off Polish armies being able to intercept the German 10th Army elements near Warsaw. Those armies turn around, okay, and hit the German 8th Army right in the side in a flank attack. Now, this begins, okay, the Battle of Bzura, okay, where the Germans fight a huge Polish army. Now, the Germans, of course, using their tanks, artillery, aircraft, are much more manoeuvrable, much more mechanized. And during the battle, which the Poles fight fiercely, the Poles put up a massive attack and they fight fiercely. But sadly, the increased mobility of the German army allows them to cut off, encircle, separate, and mop up pockets. And in the end, by the end of the Battle of Bzura, near 20 Polish divisions are wiped wiped out. The Germans take nearly 180,000 prisoners from the Battle of Bzura and the pockets created themselves, which is a huge loss to the Polish army. Now, by September 15th, okay, Warsaw is already now surrounded by German forces. Now, the remaining parts of the Polish army around the town of Lwów, okay, which is now in Soviet Russia, and Chelm, they now comprise some 40 infantry divisions with some cavalry brigades, etc., etc. But the Polish army is totally unprepared for the absolute stab in the back that is to come. Now, on September 16th, okay, Warsaw, which is completely surrounded now by German forces, is given an issue to surrender. Okay, now Warsaw refuses to surrender. Poland refuses to surrender Warsaw. But basically by September 17th, Molotov declares that the Polish government has ceased to exist. Okay, and on September 17th, also, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under Stalin officially give orders for their troops to advance into eastern Poland. So the Polish army, which is already in disarray, and the Polish army, which is trying to, conciliate its forces to try and stage some kind of fight back against the German armies, the German panzers, is completely taken aback when mass Soviet armies enter Poland from their eastern flank. Now, the Polish president, okay, Ignacy Mościcki, his government and the commander-in-chief at Polish Armed Forces, Marshal Rydz, basically resign and they move to the country of Romania. Incredible attack. The Germans have just overrun Poland, okay? Poland's defences are overrun. Their armies are being encircled, dissected like a steak, chopped up and mopped up by the motorised and infantry divisions. The Germans, within 2 weeks, already reached Warsaw. It is an absolutely frightening display of blitzkrieg tactics when faced against an enemy whose forces are still fighting for the most part on the old World War I routine. And like I said initially, the French plan to help the Polands lower the length of their front lines from over 1,000 miles to over 400 miles to concentrate the forces to better withstand the attacks of the German mechanised units was ignored. They had this crazy plan to invade Germany upon Germany attacking the borders and take Berlin, which is in the flights of fancy. There was no way that the Polish armies would ever reach Berlin. Once those armies were cut up and encircled, cut off from communication, cut off from supplies, those armies had a limited time frame to survive anyway. Obviously, as well, I think the German advance, aided by the blitzkrieg tactics, was also helped by the terrain, okay, because Poland did have a large border. The Danzig corridor had been created to separate Prussia from Germany, so it gave the Germans the ability to mass armies in areas so that they could better target certain areas, river crossings, destroying certain Polish supply lanes, so they could quickly be able to dissect and carve up the Polish army, and it really, really was a frightening campaign. So, where are we? So, by September 19th, okay, is another historic day in the Polish campaign, because this is the day that the first Red Army units meet up with German troops at Brest-Litovsk, okay? They finally meet during Russia's attack into eastern Poland, which meets only limited resistance. The main bulk of Polish army has already been destroyed by the Wehrmacht, and they only meet token resistance. They finally meet up at Brest-Litovsk, which obviously would be a future launch campaign, one of the main areas for Operation Barbarossa on the Western Front. Not one of the main areas where the armies were massed, but it would be one of the most forward positions on the Eastern German border, directly bordering the Soviet Union prior to Operation Barbarossa, which I will do a huge breakdown on in reference to the greatest invasion in history. I will do not only the events of Barbarossa as we go through, but I will also do I will do a full video on all the planning, the different plans they had, what different strategies they had, a breakdown of forces. Of course, Barbarossa is a major event in military history, more so than the invasion of Poland, which was a quick event. But also, everything didn't go the Germans' way. At times the Poles put up very stiff resistance. The Battle of Bzura, with the Poznan and remains of Pomeranian armies, really put on a hard fight. And there were other areas where the Poles really put on a hard fight, like the German 10th Army initial attack towards Warsaw. They were driven back to a river barrier, the starting positions. The Poles put up a valiant fight, but ultimately fighting the mechanized forces at Wehrmacht, they were no match. Now, by basically September 19th, the Polish campaign is over. You know, the only thing remaining in the Polish campaign is basically those Polish armies that have already been cut apart, dissected, are still holding up, still have some supplies, you know, that are currently now surrounded by motorised and infantry forces of the Wehrmacht. Basically, the Poles have been crushed, okay, within 18 days. 18 days. You know, I bet the generals on Verdun, Somme, I bet generals at the Battle of Ypres, you know, would have loved to have been able to gain a military success like this in 18 days. But, you know, the Wehrmacht and Hitler and Guderian, Rommel, all these generals, they changed the rules of warfare. And the whole world was stunned when Poland was wiped out in 18 days. Now, by September 27th, of course, Warsaw besieged, subjected to savage land and air bombardment, is forced to surrender. Now, initially, Poland tried having Warsaw declared a free city, but due to elements of the Polish army going there, Adolf Hitler indeed ordered that Warsaw be considered a military fortress, and thus, you know, with it not being deemed a civilian target, being deemed a military target, the Luftwaffe, you know, could absolutely bomb the living daylights out of Warsaw, and eventually it was forced to surrender. You know, near 170,000 men were taken prisoner in the Warsaw Pocket. You know, September 28th, okay, in one of the last centres of Polish resistance, the 10 divisions encircled on September 10th in the city of Modlin and the area of Kutno surrender, okay. They fought for pretty much 19 days, near enough 19 days, surrounded under continual attack by Wehrmacht. They are forced to surrender. And then on September 29th, okay, Ribbentrop and Molotov re-look at the deal they made to partition Poland into eastern and western spheres for Germany and the USSR alike. The demarcation line is looked at, and the deal that they finally come up with, okay, the territory occupied by the Germans is the richest area in Poland, taking like half of its industry and plus 20 million inhabitants of Poland, while the Russians annex a huge total of 77,000 square miles of Polish territory and absorb 30 million Polish inhabitants into the USSR. And of course, that line formed there would later be the partial line that Barbarossa, the violent, huge invasion of the USSR, would come from. So, as well as all that and the destruction of Poland, we also have another treaty signed between the USSR and Estonia, okay, where basically Estonia signed a treaty with USSR of mutual assistance, which allowed the USSR to take and use Estonia's naval bases to increase the ability of the USSR to have prominence in the Baltic Sea region. Now, on September 30th, okay, the Polish government is set up in exile in Paris under the leadership of General Sikorski. This is only the first. You know, later we would have, of course, the Free French Army set up in the UK after the fall of France, that we will get to. But basically, the Polish government has now ceased to exist. And by October 1st, okay, the last defenders, you know, of the Hella Peninsula, north of Danzig, surrender. The Germans succeed in capturing some Polish warships, while some manage to escape and end up in British ports. So there ends, okay, the Polish campaign, the official last mopping up of operations by October 1st. The Germans have lost over 10,000 dead, over 30,000 wounded, and nearly 3,500 soldiers missing. The Poles, meanwhile, okay, their million-man army is effectively being dissected and destroyed. Nearly 900,000 prisoners have been taken. Near 700,000 prisoners have been taken in huge pockets at Warsaw, the Lodz pocket, everything else. Near 700,000 prisoners taken by Germans, and over 200,000 prisoners that handed themselves into the USSR's invasion of eastern Poland. So that effectively ends the Polish campaign. Its last official end is the 6th of October, at which time Poland officially ceases to exist, aside from the separate free Polish government set up in France. And really, this leaves Europe at a standstill. You know, the German attacks, the French attacks on the German lines, you know, while mere pinpricks, and really without much heart there to put any pressure on Germany, had effectively dealt a blow. The German army now will continue restabilising the Polish region, now start transferring forces back from Polish territory that they can release back into Germany towards the Western Front. Of course, when we come to the invasion of France, we will go through the invasion of France and the build-up and the varying plans there too. Because the French campaign, like the Polish campaign, the French army was much bigger than the Polish army. It was much more modernised. Of course, we had the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, in France and Belgium at the time. Also the countries of Holland and Belgium, who really tried keeping neutrality until it was too late. But really, the destruction of France is equally as impressive. The tactics and the way Germany carves up France is equally impressive. France lasts a matter of weeks before it's overrun. But we will get to that when we get to that. That is coming in 1940. We have a lot of ground to cover prior to then. So what else, went on during this time? Now, on September 19th, the First British Army Corps lands in France, so Britain is already moving troops to France in September of 1939 in preparation for what they feel no doubt will be an attack on Germany or an attack from Germany on the Western powers. And basically, also on September 27th, Hitler tells, his main commanders that he intends to attack France. Now some German generals, just prior to the end of the campaign in Poland, some German generals are taken aback, basically saying, we can't attack France, we've just finished the Polish campaign, we're not ready to attack France at all. But Hitler is very eager, Hitler has an intense hatred for the French. He views them as part of the reason that the horrendous Treaty of Versailles was imposed upon Germany at the end of World War I, along with the other Allied powers, and Hitler would exact his own vicious version of revenge in the peace treaty, the armistice with France, that we will also go through. Now, also on September 30th, the German pocket battleship, the Admiral Graf Spee, sank the British steamship Clement. So one of the German pocket battleships sinks the British steamship Clement. Now, also, on October 2nd, delegates from 21 American countries met in Panama, to set up along the coast of each nation a security zone. So basically what they did along the Americas was, have a negotiation to set up a security zone, which would extend anything from 200 miles to 600 miles off the coast of these American states, that they would declare, that ships at war should not enter. Now, also on October 6th, Hitler spoke before the Reichstag and appealed for peace, proposing that the Western powers should recognise the new status quo in Eastern Europe with his carving up of the Polish army and the Russian USSR deal to carve up Poland. Now, obviously, the French and British have been hit by Hitler too many times, and they refuse to give any leeway to Hitler and outright reject any such talk. While on October 10th, a mutual assistance treaty is also signed between the USSR and Lithuania. Now the city of Vilna, annexed by Poland in 1922, they are restored to Lithuania, while the Russians again, like Estonia, gain access to sea and air bases in Lithuania, thus expanding their influence into the Baltic Sea further. Now, on October 11th, the French Premier, Edouard Daladier, in a broadcast at Nation, scornfully put down any proposals of Adolf Hitler that they should accept the status quo in Eastern Europe and that they will go for peace. Edouard Daladier immediately dismisses talk of peace with Germany. Now, the following day, Neville Chamberlain also follows Daladier's move by also rejecting any talk of peace with Hitler's Germany. Now, also on October 12th, talks begin that will lead to me, the next major battles of the war. Talks begin between Russia and Finland, talking about exchange of territory and the secession of certain territories. Of course, that will lead to what we call the Winter War of 1939 between the USSR and Finland, which we will, of course, cover in a future video. Now, also on October 16th, there is the first air attack on British territory by German aircraft. Okay, German aircraft launched their first attack on British territory, and in the Firth of Forth, damage the cruisers Southampton and Edinburgh and the destroyer Mohawk. So there ends this latest video. This has been a big video, and videos covering the war will continue like this, okay? We are going to go through the war in fine detail. There's a long way to go yet. I have barely covered a month. Well, I've covered nearly 2 months of the war, but the videos are going to get thicker and deeper as the battles become bigger, more countries are drawn in. Major campaigns in the west against France and the British forces are launched. The Battle of Britain, of course, the invasion of Norway, Denmark to come, the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-1940, and the fantastic successes the Finnish army had against the USSR before the reformed USSR armies on that front merged in 1940 to launch huge concentrated assaults. But there ends my full World War II breakdown. Part 2. Poland is effectively dissected, cut up and destroyed. Its million-man army is reduced to ragtag remnants. The Wehrmacht scores an incredible victory in the east. The Soviet Union annexes 77,000 square miles of Poland. Thus ends part 2 of my ultimate World War II breakdown. Part 3 will come in coming days, and also in coming days will also come the first entries of the equipment of World War II, namely the Admiral Graf Spee spec breakdown. I am out for now. Hope you've enjoyed.